Welcome, my name is Himanshu Upadhyaya. I teach at Azim Premji University. As part of Rivers of Life Festival at Azim Premji University, which is happening from 2nd November to 16th November, we have with us Ashish Kothari. Ashish works with the environmental action group called Kalpvriksha, and Shrishtee Bajpayee has been giving voice to this idea about rivers and natural elements having rights and the identity as a legal person. So starting with Ashish Bhai, requesting you to tell me what school days in Delhi during those young age were like, and what environment or environment action was such. I believe you established a very popular nature club while you were at the Hindu College. Can you?
Yeah, so my interest in environment arose out of love for animals and sort of interest in animal rights issues. And I realized very quickly that by itself is not enough. One needs to look at the larger issue of environment, because also in Delhi in those days, we were growing up in a city which was becoming increasingly polluted, and also one of the world's largest urban forests, the Delhi Ridge, which is the last part of the Aravallis, that was getting destroyed more and more. So we decided that, and we used to go there for bird watching and things like that. So then we were seeing the destruction, we realized that we should do something about it also, not just enjoy ourselves in nature, but also do something to protect it. So that's how the idea started in high school. To do something, we had a demonstration against the destruction of the Delhi Ridge, we had some other actions with regard to hunting of endangered species of birds, etc. And that's when the idea of starting a group, which became Kalpvriksha in 1979. Then when I joined college, we also started a nature club in Hindu College in Delhi University. We started a nature club. But through all of these, we were kind of trying to educate ourselves about environmental issues, going to the Chipko movement area in Tehri Garhwal, for instance, and learning that environment is not just about saving trees, it's also about economic development, it's about women's issues, gender issues, etc. Then doing a long trek along the Narmada River, which is where the involvement with the movement came back in 1983. So anyway, all of this was happening as we were kind of, as from graduating from being teenagers to the 20s, and it was a very steep learning curve. That's how my involvement in environmental movements actually grew.
So when you were growing up in Delhi and Save the Ridge movement slowly began, what the green cover looked like around Aravallis, and was quarrying and mining a big threat to the ridge?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Aravallis as a whole were threatened with quarrying, mining, destruction for urban townships and many other highways, etc. And we were also then seeing much more dust actually coming into Delhi because of all this loss of green cover. The Delhi Ridge itself did not have so much mining, quarrying, but it had other things like an army installation, roads cutting through it, blasting for that, construction of buildings and things like that, and garbage dumping. So those were the issues that we were kind of picking up on. Also, this whole notion of development with regard to forests. So they did not want to leave the forest as a wilderness, which is what it was, but to actually manicure it, make it gardens and things like that. I remember once we went to the Lieutenant Governor and we said that why is this happening? He said we are a Delhi Development Authority. Delhi Development Authority means areas have to be developed. Forest can't be left as jungly, whatever. So there were, it wasn't just a physical fight, it was also a fight about mindset and mentality and how one looks at the rest of nature.
Correct. Concepts and ideas. Yeah. So what an air in Delhi looked like in your younger days in high school and college as you were putting together with like-minded people, the nature club, the activities around Save the Ridge movement. Yamuna, what would be the status of Yamuna in those days? And the right to clean air movement will come at some point of time with Anil Agarwal coming with Center for Science and Environment. But if you, because even for generation of people like me who studied in Delhi, the fights that you started about a decade back before we came as students to Delhi would be something that we would like to learn from.
So, I mean, for us, water pollution was a very big issue, because I remember seeing these shocking statistics of how much E. coliform, organisms were in the water before the Yamuna entered Delhi, and the increase to some 2.5 million per liter, something milliliter by the time it left Delhi. We were like shocked out of our wits, saying, "Gosh, what is the city doing to a river like the Yamuna?" The same with air pollution. But the Indraprasth power station, bang in the middle of Delhi, was spewing out enormous amounts of pollution, right? So we did a cycle rally against water pollution. We did 2 or 3 demonstrations opposite the Indraprasth power station, hurling up about 15, 20 of us, very small numbers. But we just wanted to try and raise awareness that this is the city we're growing up in. If I'm going to be here another 30 years, I don't want to live in an environment where I'm choked or where I constantly have problems with my stomach because the water is so badly polluted. But not just me, poorer people, because we were also realizing that this was actually, we were still privileged, no, as middle class people. But the village next to the Badarpur power station or the villages downstream the Yamuna, in the Yamuna, would be even worse affected because they were already poor, they didn't have access to medical facilities, and they were the ones drinking straight from the Yamuna or breathing that air in much more than us. So for us, it was also therefore a fight about class inequality. I mean, those terms we didn't even know then, but we began to sort of learn them about how the poorer are affected with these sorts of things even more than we. So it was multiple things we were kind of, but air and water really bad. Not as bad as air is now in Delhi, so it's become much worse, but it was already quite bad then.
And very soon you were also, in terms of your ideas and impact, expanding, even as being the nature club of one college, the Hindu college. Very soon I find your work taking you to Bharatpur bird sanctuary and the kind of conflicts that you had started addressing. Bharatpur Wildlife Sanctuary had, Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary, had this tiff of the local community accessing the grazing, and then there was a violence, police repression. And I believe the team went for the fact finding, and
So I, because wildlife and animal rights and all was so close to my heart, and many of my friends and colleagues also, for us that incident in which Bharatpur was one of our favorite places to go and look at birds, right? Incident in which 7 villagers were killed entering the park because they used to have grazing rights, and overnight those grazing rights were stopped without providing any alternatives. So they entered and they were shot at, and 7 villagers were killed. So we did immediately the next day 3 people went from Kalpvriksha and did an investigation. And around that time we were already beginning to ask ourselves this question. Conservation of course is crucial, but by whom and for whom and at whose cost? And that Bharatpur incident really brought that home very sharp. That you cannot have animal rights without also looking at human issues and human rights and livelihood, or the other way around. And so therefore since then we've been trying to figure out what is a conservation model that puts both the rights of nature and the rights of human beings together. There is no necessary conflict there. In fact, there should be a necessary complementarity. And that's the model that we've been trying to argue for now ever since early 80s.
But how hard was this cognitive fight, as you pointed out? Because you were also operating during a decade where the dominant narrative and framework was human-wildlife conflict, human-animal conflict.
Yeah.
Only recently we have anthropologists and social ethnographers starting to lay attention to animal-human relationality. If we look at Radhika Govindrajan's work, for example, Animal Intimacy is a brilliant book that she has written that tells us about the relationality of hill people, communities, peasants and their animal. But back then, where you were doing the work, there was this framing of human-wildlife conflict, human-animal conflict. And there was a model of conservation that was all fortress conservation. There was this belief that biotic and abiotic disturbance, and that is the language, correct? When you look at some of these old documents, so how hard was that fight to bring the people and say that people within and I believe that book that you, Vasant Sabharwal and Mahesh wrote together, showing us a way away from the dominant model of trying to give the conservation with fences and forest guards and the rifles. How hard was that fight to tell the forest department and the powers that be that communities are at the center of the
No,
conservation
it
issue?
was very hard. It still is very hard, by the way. It's not as if we have managed to shift the paradigms so significantly in India. Many other parts of the world it has, but not so much in India. It was very hard, but that was because conservation was being dominated by an urban middle class. Ever since the early sort of 20th century, there's been that, the American model being picked up by Rajas and princes and people like that in India, and then of course the British colonial rulers, and then post-independence also, the same class of people talking about tiger conservation, etc., not recognizing or deliberately ignoring the fact that communities have lived with wildlife, they have coexisted with wildlife. There isn't a conflict in the way we are looking at it, right? Of course, that doesn't mean that tigers and human beings are shaking hands all the time. There is tension, but there is still coexistence. Now, that recognition was zero. Either deliberately ignored or simply not recognized in the formal conservation circles, government and NGOs. So for us it was a huge struggle. In fact, even within Kalpvriksha there was a point at which those who were more inclined to human rights and those who were more inclined to wildlife conservation kind of split. So we had our own internal difficulties and splits there. But we kept saying that there is a middle path possible, that you can do both. And Chipko actually was a very important thing for us, because Chipko is where the women were showing that they can live with the forest and the wildlife there. They were saying that if the logging happens in the Himalayan forest, we lose out, but we can probably get employment somewhere else. But what will the tiger or the leopard or the monkey or the deer do? Where will they go? So that was coming to us, and we actually got, educated by them that coexistence is possible. So for us, it was also then important to show examples like that, where communities are conserving things, no? So our community conservation focus actually started around that time. We only called it community conserved areas much later. But already we were beginning to understand and document and talk about the fact that people are living with wildlife. So why do you want them to be shifted out? Why do you want to create this alienation, this rift between wildlife and people? So we actually also started a program called Building Bridges, which was about building bridges between the formal wildlife conservation people and the human rights people, which went a certain direction. Medha Patkar and Valmik Thapar and Bittu Saigal, all these people were involved, right? After a point, it also didn't work very well, but it created at least a new narrative of how you could have coexistence in wildlife areas.
So, Shrishti, tell us a bit about your work with this conceptualizing and communicating that rivers can have rights, and recognizing rivers as legal persons is very important within the legal discourses also. How does this work shaping up in India? But how has the concept come up? Since when? And how has courts in India responded to this?
Yeah, so the conception or the worldview behind rivers being or rest of nature being alive, as Ashish was also mentioning in his intervention, has been there among communities that have been living along the rivers or other natural entities. And so that separation has never really, there is of course that rest of nature is alive, but that separation of humans and nature is very limited if you speak to people living along these natural entities. So I think the emergence of the idea comes from that and is rooted in that. So the communities that I have been working with in Gadchiroli, central India, had a similar conception that we can be displaced if a mining project comes in our forest, but what will happen to the birds in the forest, to the animals in the forest, and also spirits in the forest. So it's not just about humans' existence, but it is also about other beings that live in these forests and other natural spaces. So it's that they're not seen as resources, they're not just seen as like say the environmentalists will see birds which are beautiful and other such things, but as having agency of their own. So that's where I think the idea emerges from, that they have their own agency, they have their own ways and rules of actually governing territories, like we see also in the articulations of the Dongriya cones in Niyamgiri, where they say Niyam Raja has his own rules and laws, by the name itself, Niyam Raja. So in that way, that's where the idea is rooted or has to be rooted, where peoples and communities have seen rest of nature being alive, having its own agencies, having its own rules and laws. So in courts in India, what is happening at this moment is that in 2017, an act was basically an order was judgment was passed by the Uttarakhand High Court recognizing the rights of river Ganga and Yamuna, starting from its originating glaciers to its tributaries, forests, catchment areas, and other such, as having rights of a legal person, which basically means three things: that your injury can be recognized, you can be sued, and can file a case in the court of law. So these are the three aspects in the most basic sense of what it means to be a legal person. Subsequently, also the same High Court passed a judgment recognizing the rights of entire animal kingdom. And then same judge also in Punjab and Haryana High Court passed a similar judgment recognizing the rights of the Sukhna Lake in city of Chandigarh. And then in April also Madras High Court recognized the rights of Mother Earth. All these judgments have been not have been top down in terms that the high courts have passed those judgments. Petitions were never filed in arguing that natural entities should have rights like that of a legal person and have their problems and limitations. But they also are in many ways changing the language, or I mean, the biggest problem also of our discourses has been that we have had this language imperialism where the nature itself is devoid of any aliveness. So they're beginning to change that language. They're saying that the rivers are alive. They're saying that the mountains are alive.
This entire idea that was there in thinking, in the writings of Bacon and others, of looking at nature merely as resource pool that communities derive from, humans derive from. And within the legal sort of discourse also, it's emphasis always on the human beings or the state, legal entity, corporate actions, human actions, and it's always anthropocentrism that has informed the language of the courts. How did the legal discourse moved away from that sort of anthropocentrism to ecocentrism, to looking at the rights of natural elements and giving them the life as a legal person? Did it happen somewhere else in some other courts? Can you walk us through?
Sure. So the very first case that came in the form of Western legal intervention was when the Ecuadorian constitution was getting redrafted after the left government revolution that took place there, and the indigenous communities in Ecuador were very strongly asking that their worldviews of Pachamama, Buen Vivir, that is good living, can form the discourse, or can find some place in the redrafting of the constitution. And what they came up was something like rights of nature. So in the Ecuadorian constitution in 2008, rights of nature was formally recognized, and that started somewhat a movement to speak about rights of nature, connecting it to communities, cosmologies, and worldviews. And so in Bolivia, rights of Mother Earth were given, and then in US, several counties passed ordinances recognizing rights of lakes, etc., and then connecting it to right to healthy environment, right of future generations. A very inspiring one was the New Zealand one, where after 150 years of struggle of indigenous Iwi Maori community, they came to a settlement with the Crown, which is the New Zealand government, that their connection with the river, their cosmology, that we are the river and the river is us, finds a legal space, and the historical injustice being done to them by damming and diverting the Wanganui River be taken back. So that's how they came to this agreement of recognizing Wanganui River ecosystem, which includes the indigenous peoples there, part of a legal treaty that they signed. And so they came up with a legislature that recognized, which was called TV Avatupa Act, which recognized the rights of Wanganui river ecosystem. And what they very importantly did was that who speaks for the river, and that's an important question. And they said that it would be indigenous peoples, the local communities that are immediately dependent on it. So the river can't go to the court of law and fight for her rights. So it will be the indigenous communities. It will also be government and state representatives. It could also be civil society, and they are part of the guardianship. So that has been an inspiring case of changing the complete discourse, and a mix of traditional and modern systems. A compromise was reached. It's not, as a lot of people from that communities have said, that it is not an ideal compromise, but it is a compromise towards a reform or a transformation that we intend to achieve. And then there have been several cases across the world, and not just rivers, but species of wild rice. Now there's a work going on in response to some people trying to colonize Mars and Moon, to also talk about rights of Moon and Arctic and other such things. So lots of innovations happening, and so a lot of also caution needs to be in terms of what fundamentally we are asking to transform. But yeah, several cases across the world that have changed the discourse.
And this is very important. Like, who shall represent in a court of law
Yeah.
once you have recognized the right of rivers as the legal persons? And it's very important that once again the state doesn't plant itself as the guardian, speaking on behalf of rivers always. So as you pointed out, the indigenous communities, the riparian communities who derive the livelihood and who have an intricate relationality with rivers needs to be the guardian. Also, as you were pointing out, the risks are now huge because the human ego has grown on and on and on only. Now we have started to harbor imagination about being able to do deep sea mining. There is a nation state government who has gone and planted its flag at the bottom of Arctic Ocean, trying to lay claim to mineral resources if ever they get explored. So how, on the one hand, while we talk about the rights of river and natural elements, on the other hand, there are all these corporate imaginations of trying to make space travel affordable for poor peasants. How does this conceptual battle are something that we always have to keep fighting about? And your ideas on this?
Yeah, it is a very hard battle. Also, with the whole rights of nature movement, that is a caution that some of us have been part of it, trying to bring forth very strongly, and especially from the global south, that it is important to remember that we can't just grant rights to nature or recognize rights to nature without questioning the fundamental systems of domination oppression, and that is about questioning the extractive growth model. So in Ecuador, same country that granted rights of nature, also spoke about community mining and extractive mining industries, or was in agreements with uh, countries like China for deep sea mining and other such things. And so the communities there and civil society groups have actively been asking that, you can't have rights of nature and mining going hand in hand, because then it's just a false solution. So one has to question the extractive growth model. We also have to question the nation state domination, as we all learn from the rest of nature that it is contiguous, it is not following any nation state boundaries. So transboundary collaborations, cross country collaboration and alliances becomes a very strong part of it. So nations can't keep fighting and then also talk about that we have granted rights to river enders. China, Pakistan, India will have to work together so that the rights are ensured of the river enders and other such entities. Again, it is important that we question the limitations of this particular legal system. Even though it offers that opportunity that we can change the language, it is still very limited in its implementation. So how we also bring in other customary, people's own customary ways of being and living and decision making also form part of the formal legal systems. So how do we build more pluriversal legal frameworks? And also, fourth is recognizing that the rights of nature is just a means towards a larger transformation that we want to achieve. So until unless we question the economic systems, we question the political discourses, the social injustices that we are currently living in, we won't be adequately able to really ensure rights of nature. It would be just any other environmental protection law that will just be used as means to sanction the environmental destruction rather than stop it. So those cautions become very important when we're talking about rights of nature.
That brings me back.
Just to add a quick point there, I think even the notion of what it is to be human, because with the last few hundred years, humans have been seen as being outside of nature. It's like we're not, so it's humans and nature, humans. But indigenous peoples, or what the Maori say, we are the river and the river is us, or here the Varli tribe, we were recently with one of the Varli tribe artists and singers from Bombay, the RA colony, where they're having a struggle against a metro thing coming in the middle of their forest. I'm saying the leopard is us, we are the leopard. We can still move away, but where will the leopard go, right? So this notion of what it is to be human and what it is to develop and progress, the way certain form of modernity has brought to us, which has alienated us from the rest of nature and taken us in a certain direction of perpetual growth and all of that, that has to also change. That has to fundamentally change, and this is where indigenous peoples, many of whom are still living in harmony, in relative harmony with the rest of nature, have so much to teach us. We think we are developed and progressed now. We are actually destroying the world. So this is a even more fundamental transformation that needs to take place, which is where some of our work is also looking at these fundamental alternatives. Alternatives to the capitalist growth model, alternatives to the nation state, looking at more, for instance, bioregional or biocultural regional landscapes where the whole river is governed collectively by the communities there, etc. Those are the sorts of very fundamental transformations.
So that brings me back to the ideas of river and the very initial debates after India's independence. Sometimes I wonder why was it that while drafting the constitution and putting rivers into which list Ambedkar and his colleagues did what they did. Not only that, but they empowered India's parliament to pass a legislation to solve, if ever there would come disputes on the water sharing between the upper riparian state and the lower riparian state. So, like what we were saying, the framework was conflict or dispute, and then state and the drafters of constitution and legal instrument trying to think how to solve disputes. So when, for example, you and Rajiv went for a trek on Narmada, what were the discourses around Gujarat trying to lay claim to the larger share of Narmada water, Madhya Pradesh trying to say that the longest part of the river flow is within our state, and the states were speaking to each other, correct? And were communities and the peasants and farmers and Adivasis finding a voice within that 10 years long legal dispute resolution thing that we call Narmada Water Dispute Tribunal 1979 to 1989. So if you can walk us through some of those memories of early days.
So when we were walking along we did a 50-day walk along the river in 1983, we spoke to villagers living along the thing, but we also spoke to Parikramawasis, that is the people who do a 3,400 kilometer circumambulation of the river barefoot. It's a very old tradition. And for all of them, this notion of the river being cut into states, and then the notion of dams actually blocking the river was just totally alien. They say it's one river, it's one flow. How can this happen? माँ नर्मदा को आप कैसे रोक सकते हैं इस तरह से, right? And how can you cut it up into these sorts of portions? So, but they were never involved in the disputes tribunal. First of all, for them, they would say, why even call it a disputes tribunal? I mean, I'm putting words into their mouth now. They didn't actually say that. Many of them didn't even know there was a disputes tribunal. Nobody had told them. But that's how the articulation was, that if it's a single river and it's our mother, then the way we look at that, and the way we treat it, and the way we relate to it is very different from thinking of it as who will get how much electricity and who will get how much irrigation water. In Hemal Kasa, further down in Gadchiroli, there was a struggle against two mega hydroelectricity projects in the 1970s, right? Bhopalpatnam in Champalli. And the Adivasi population, the indigenous people there, when they mobilized, they were saying it's not just that don't want to lose our homes and our lands because of these dams, but this river is our mother. How can anybody shackle our mother like this, right? So it's a very different form of looking at the rest of, or relating to the rest of nature. So you're absolutely right that this whole notion that you assume there's going to be disputes because you've already broken up a natural ecosystem into multiple portions, in this case states, but it could be between countries in South Asia, for instance, is itself fundamentally flawed. If you were looking at the river as one entity and one landscape to be governed like that, then you wouldn't think of that as, the Kaveri tribunal would not be needed if one was looking at the river in that sense, right? So this is why, as Shrishti is saying, we have to question even political boundaries and how political boundaries, either because of colonial things or whatever reasons political boundaries have been taken. Tibet and Ladakh are one massive trans-Himalayan high altitude landscape. Now you've got a fence and armies on both sides in the middle of it. Wildlife can't go back and forth. Nomadic people can't go back and forth. That has to be fundamentally questioned also in order to be able to solve the ecological crises and the livelihoods crises and the climate crisis. This is also a climate issue, very fundamentally so. So for us, for the last few decades, this has been a very fundamental thing. The more we look at it, the more we say that unless we make these fundamental transformations, the superficial solutions that are coming in, like carbon trading and recycling and all of that, will not solve these very fundamental things.
So, when you did the trek back there in 1983, 84, and you wrote on the trek, and that was about 4 years before Narmada Bachao Andolan will start mobilizing people across. From mid-80s to late 80s, how the discourse was changing, how this massive terminal dam on the river Narmada, on the Narmada Basin called Sardar Sarovar project, was changing ideas. How did the mobilization come up?
So I think what was happening was, already there were movements in the 70s on rehabilitation, because some projects were already coming up, like Tawa had come up upstream, etc. So people were already demanding better rehabilitation. They were not necessarily questioning the dam somewhere, but mostly it was, okay, how do you give us better rehabilitation? Right? So those struggles were already
I think Tawa had also started waking communities up on the challenges in command area and irrigation zone.
Exactly.
I believe there was something called Mitti Bachao Andolan.
Exactly. So because what was happening was that the black soil there was getting badly, there was too much waterlogging and salinization taking place, because black soils are of that nature that too much water going in, it doesn't drain out fast, right? So Tawa, the command area, already farmers were agitating, and also of course those who were displaced were talking about better rehabilitation. But they were still not raising some of the or they were raising it very weakly, its fundamental issues of whether this is development at all. That comes up with the Sardar Sarovar movement. So we had raised that question in 1983-84 with our trek. Our article, report on that was titled Development or Destruction, right? But the Andolan, when it started 85 onwards, actually made that a very central pillar, obviously. So the debate and the discourse, not just in the valley, but actually nationally over the next few years, began to also look into this more broader issue of what is development. Not just that this particular dam should or should not be built, but that what is development itself. So then struggles against industrialization, against chemical farming, against commercial trawling in our coastal areas, against big dams, these kind of began to coalesce into a larger national platform, which eventually became the National Alliance for People's Movements or the Bharat Jan Andolan, etc., asking these very basic questions of what is development, what is well-being, what is, where are we headed, who is benefiting, who is losing out, who's taking decisions. So the fundamental issue, even in the earlier points about bioregionalism and so on, was what is democracy? That question also began to come up there. Why should somebody sitting in Bhopal or New Delhi or wherever take decisions on what should happen to the people and the wildlife and the forests of the Narmada Valley? Or people sitting in New Delhi decide what should happen to the forests in Himalaya. That's what Chipko Andolan was asking, right? So democracy actually being about the voice of the people and decision making by the people were also things that actually began to come up at that time. And so in that sense, Sardar Sarovar project, it has come up, and one could say therefore the movement is a failure. But to me, actually, it's an enormous contribution of the movement that these debates and discussions began or became much more visible and much more national and global. And because of which, actually, I would say that probably a whole lot of other destructive projects never came up or were stopped, inspired by this movement. So that's a huge contribution, I think, that was being given.
For younger people like Shrishti and me, it's only through the memories of you elders that we get to. So I'm going to quiz you on some other memories also. When the Bargi was coming up, and there was an opposition movement to Bargi as well, only through Jarna's wonderful documentary film Kaise Ji Bore, we get some of the glimpses of what submergence were like, but you would have traveled to those areas of Begas in the upstream, same river basin, Nagda basin, Bargi depth. Any quick recap from what did you see there?
So one is total bewilderment of the people, saying, you know, how can anybody ask us to leave our homes? We've been here forever really, right? So how can anybody ask us to leave? How can anybody ask our spirits to leave? Even in Manipali, Baega and all Adivasi, but even in some of the non-Adivasi areas, people were saying, but okay, we might be able to leave. What will happen to our God in that temple? उसको थोड़ी यहाँ से हम मारे जा सकते हैं, उसकी तो जगह यही है. Same thing with leopard or tiger or crocodile in the Narmada river. So actually the Baigas were also asking this question with Bargi and also with Taba also, people already displaced were saying, who gives them the right to displace us or our spirits or the animals? So these were some of the issues, and also actually in a tragic way, people having the faith that no, our nature, our forests and our rivers will not allow this to happen. No dam will stand in the way because Ma Narmada will just wash it away. There was a very fundamental belief there, in a sense a tragic kind of a belief. No? So these were the sorts of narratives that we were encountering. Very disturbing at one level, right? But also inspiring at another level. So kind of mobilizations that were taking place.
I remember having grown up in a state where Gujarati is spoken as mother tongue, and I was growing up in late 80s. I did my 12th in 1992, when you were walking from Madhya Pradesh, starting from Rajghat up to Khairkuwa and blocked at Khairkuwa. I would have seen some of the newspaper headlines, but those are not what I will refer to. There were two prominent weekly magazines, and for us, there were two very idealist, very ethical journalists in our growing up years as teenager Gujaratis. Those were Kanti Bhatt and Sheila Bhatt. And Kanti Bhai says, when he starts Abhiyan, that व्यापारी पत्रकारित्वથી ગળે આવી ગયો હતો. Like it was too much in the old weekly that he had seen, which was so much of what he calls business and corporate interests driving the journalism. And so Kanti Bhatt and Sheila Bhatt were trying to give Gujarati society the ethical journalism. And I believe my memory of, without having ever walked across the bank of Narmada, comes from the beautiful letter that Ashwini Bhatt writes after his visit to the first Satyagraha, where he says, while climbing down from the rocky terrain of Happeshwar, I cried. That's the title of his letter. And it was the brilliance of the editors who felt that this letter, that was a personal communication, that one of the very celebrated author in our language, Ashwini Bhatt, had written to his editor friends, became the public document, because the entire letter was written in such a lyrical style of telling us what the communities were. He talks us about the Bilala Adivasis who were his host, and he talks about the Happeshwar temple that I saw in front of my eyes going into water in the 2002 when I went there. But you would have seen Shulpaneshwar temple as well, going underwater, and Shulpaneshwar before it went underwater, then Happeshwar and Koteshwar and other such. So about this beautiful ancient heritage structures of Shiva temples, very much important within the Hindu fold of the belief system. What your reflections are on how the state was looking at these temples, how the state was looking at the archaeological sites on the Narmada basin?
Well, I think this is an interesting thing because which temple can and cannot be submerged or displaced is itself part of politics, either within the religion or between religions. Right? And so these smaller ones, which are actually in Adivasi areas mostly, that's possible to displace. We of course had a good ceremony where they picked up the god, the statue, etc., and then put it somewhere else. But of course, the local people were saying that's not how you can't relocate a god. But this is what the state's response was: that no, we will relocate the temples and we'll make it exactly like it was somewhere else in the rehabilitation sites. But much more, to my mind, actually, at an even deeper level, these are structures in some sense, right? And of course, people's emotions and spiritual faiths are associated with them. But in especially the Adivasi parts of Narmada, people's emotions and spiritual faiths are as much linked to the forest and the river, which are not structures that you can pick up and put somewhere else. That was totally ignored. There was no articulation of this whatsoever. If you look at the rehabilitation plans or even the impact assessments of what displacement could do, nobody was talking about any of this. Or the archaeological sites. Narmada is possibly the oldest valley in the country. It's like, I don't know how many millions of years old, right? There are dinosaur remains, and most of those archaeological or prehistoric sites, we have prehistoric paintings, etc., are not even documented. When we were walking along, we were actually coming across fossil beds. We were coming across all kinds of things which nobody was documenting. There was no Archaeological Survey of India sign saying protected monument, etc. So a lot of this is gone without even being documented. We don't even know what we've lost, including with nature, but also especially archaeological sites, historic sites, prehistoric sites. Evidence of humans being around for tens of thousands of years is lost. It's gone, and it's going even more with any further so-called development that's taking place. We raised this issue. We actually said, at least do a full assessment of what's likely to be lost and put that into your cost-benefit analysis. But no, that actually never happened. I mean, there were 1 to stray reports that happened.
So,
but my contention here is that it's not just the physical thing like the structures and the rock paintings and all that's crucial, but the non-material part, which to my mind is as even more important, is the links, the sort of deep emotional, spiritual links between a people and their landscape, which is not physically manifested in a structure, which were lost. And that's nowhere in anybody's calculations.
So, back then when Vijay Paranjpe was writing for Intech, the book on high dams on River Narmada, or for example, Claude Alvarez and Ramesh Bilore's book, Temples or Tombs, Last Dams in Modern India's History. How was the state and how was the dominant media, dominant political parties responding to the fresh literature that started emerging, that shaped much of the ecological thinking, your writings, along with this. And while you say about that, I would also try and get from you idea about Suhas Paranjpe and KJ Joy trying to come forward and putting this middle ground compromise sort of formula, saying we can stop Sada Sarovar Dam and make it still viable if we stop the dam height at 110 meters. If you can.
So on the literature that was coming out questioning the dam itself, I mean, Vijay Paranjpe and all the ones that you mentioned, we also did, for instance, something called Muddy Waters, which questioned the benefits in the command area itself, the predicted waterlogging, etc., which is happening, or the environmental impacts of much of such literature was produced. The thing is that the government, with all its powers, can easily come up with half a dozen economists who will say Vijay Paranjpe's analysis is all nonsense. Or others who will say, okay, there will be some environmental impact, but we will do compensatory afforestation. We will make sure waterlogging does not take place through these technical things. People like Y.K. Alag will come up, with their own kind of supposed scientific background and say these sorts of things. So in that sense, depending on what forum one is going to, if it's a court of law, chances are that they have a much bigger firepower to be able to counter us. If it's the media, there was a lot of media attention actually that we were able to bring into this, but there was also the counter media, especially the Gujarati media, for instance. So you always, if you're fighting against forces that are so powerful, and in this case it was also doubly powerful because the Gujarat government and to some extent for a large number of years the central government were kind of hand in glove. Gujarat has its own political dynamics and power. MP government, like you said also, because it was actually mostly losing out rather than benefiting, occasionally would raise these issues, but then party politics would come in and became quite muddy. So when you have that kind of a powerful force up against you, evidence of this kind that you can bring up, it might be able to convince a few, maybe one or two courts of law. It was actually enough to basically, by the way, throw out the World Bank. The World Bank itself kind of said, okay, this is not a project we want to support. So that was, bank withdrew. But when you have a force which is not willing to listen to reason, then these reasoned analyses actually help us to create a narrative, but they don't necessarily work in trying to in stopping a particular destructive project. I still think though that kind of Vijay's analysis, etc., are very crucial in creating not just a discourse, but also creating the possibilities for civil society to counter through rigorous analysis what was coming from the state. And that has been very useful in a whole bunch of other movements subsequently.
Yeah, so the Independent Review Commission's report, Redford and Moore's committee, is a wonderful document. It still exists in public memory, it still exists in public document. I think less and less university graduates pick that book and read it because now the dam is built and so is the story. But when Redford, Moore and Morse came and toured around the valley, what was the atmosphere like? Correct? I believe there was a lot of resentment by the state of Gujarat and the Gujarat government. That happened even at the time of World Commission on Dams, I believe. The Gujarat Chief Minister said that the commission is not allowed to travel. And then the Indian government developed a cold feet from inviting, although the former Water Resource Minister Ramaswamy Iyer, L.C. Jain were part of the World Commission on Dams as members. So remembering independent review, that became possible because the World Bank at least came to this thing that we would institute an independent review and we would wait for the recommendations that the review mission gives us. This would be reviewers who are technical experts, who have no prior relationship with World Bank, giving us an independent report. And those two reviewers, along with them one social anthropologist, I believe, did a great work. And if you can tell us, our audience, because much of this early history is sort of lost, and as I say, these documents are there in library, but very few graduates or research students now pick up those.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think World Bank has a terrible history, but there's every once in a while that it actually becomes a bit more conscientious, and so it instituted this independent review, and they truly were independent. They had no connection with us or the movement or with the governments or the bank, and very well respected experts in their own fields. So what happened then was that the movement made sure that they were going to places where they could actually speak to people who were impacted, affected, including the so-called beneficiaries, but especially those negatively impacted. And they made it a point to actually go to many of these sites. And of course, the Gujarat government tried to do what it could to scuttle the whole thing, but they couldn't quite do it because they still wanted the bank's money. But I think even more important than that was, or equally important, was the World Commission, like you mentioned, the World Commission on Dams, which came up partly because of the movement. Now, this, when I was speaking about the larger contribution of the movement, this is also very important there because the World Commission on Dams actually came up with a report which is not completely radical in that sense, but it has a lot of really good things about if a dam is to be built, what do you do? How do you review it? Should it or should not be built? What are the sorts of things one needs to look at? And there's a lot of very good stuff, excellent stuff there, which even India is not following any of that, but it is there. And in that sense, it is possible that the World Commission's report is in fact being very useful for movements elsewhere in the world. to stop destructive projects. So it is a big contribution. So I think the ability to move a powerful institution like the World Bank through a people's movement was shown in this instant, which again inspired movements all over the world to say that if that can happen there, why can we also not do it? Both move our own governments, but also move as powerful institution like the World Bank. So I mean, there's lots of other memories here, but I'm trying to make it short. But I accompanied the team in one of the places, others did, and there was very interesting conversations that were taking place late into the night. They didn't have this 9 to 5 kind of a thing. But it's a different set of individuals. And you can get another commission which may not actually work like that, which might want to only work very safely through a government kind of thing, which has happened also.
So then moving from that early 90s to the mid 90s, when the water is slowly rising because government of India suddenly decides to close the sluice gates, and the first submergence is seen in the valley. The Vadgaon on the Gujarat side goes into water, and some of the early villages in Maharashtra starts going into water, and the Andolan comes to Supreme Court of India with the petition, and Medha decides on the very radical idea of drowning by water, and one day before she is going to take that ultimate step, the government of India announcing the review commission within the India, mid 90s, correct? The 5-member group, so to say, that was announced, very soon would become 3-member group because the 2 would then recuse themselves. So what was this 5-member group all like, and what did their report do to the Supreme Court petition that was awaiting the resolution? If you can
well, partly actually, the origin of this is also the Sangharsh Yatra and the 23-day, or I don't remember the exact number of days in which Medha and others fasted, where VP Singh then subsequently that agreed to meet us and promised to review. So in a sense, kind of that's the beginning of it. And the review committee, I don't frankly recall so much of that, but the review committee did actually bring up, similar to the Morse Commission, did actually bring up a whole lot of the critical issues that were arising, especially on rehabilitation, because already people were being displaced, and we could see there was evidence on the ground that they were not being properly rehabilitated. Even the package that was announced for rehabilitation was not being properly implemented. So those issues came up quite strongly in that, which then went to the court. But see, if you look at it, commissions of this kind of inquiry, even the terms of reference, and then how the Supreme Court or any of the courts look at it, is they always fall short of actually asking the fundamental question of should this dam be built or not. It is their progressiveness ends at saying, if it's being built, how do you do better rehabilitation? How do you do better compensatory afforestation, etc. So the fundamental question the movement was asking was not part of though that had been promised, it was never really part of it. And the Supreme Court has got some fantastic judgments, but almost never has it actually stopped a so-called development project on the grounds of either ecological or social kinds of impacts. So I think we were maybe expecting a bit too much from this thing, but in any case, we were fighting for whatever was possible, right? So in that sense, and to get a better Supreme Court to then say pari passu that displacement can only happen, construction can only happen in pace with what the resettlement and rehabilitation, which was quite an important decision by itself. That happened, which was never implemented, by the way, but that kind of thing came up because of this, the review committee, but also the movement.
Good. So moving away from Narmada and last dam story a bit to the other sort of advocacy efforts that Kalpvriksha was involved in, this entire idea of forest is populated in India, and so the people who live in the forests must be recognized as having been endowed with these pre-existing rights that the Indian nation state and the forest department has failed to recognize, and has carried over almost a colonial sort of behavior with the forest people, forest dwellers. And how from those early 90s sort of ideas that Kalpvriksha was building on, the advocacy for having forest dwellers recognition of pre-existing Forest Rights Act will come in 2006. What those battles were like, especially 2004 to 2006, as the legislation is being pushed to get tabled in Indian Parliament. Did wildlife conservation lobby yielded ground very easily to the advocates and champions like you who were arguing that forest people and forest dwellers be recognized, not necessarily as enemies of wildlife and wildlife conservation. In just 2 years before, just 4 years before 2006, I think we had seen in May 2002 the directive from the Ministry of Environment and Forest of evicting the forest settlements, calling them illegal encroachers and all, and a spate of violence. Riding on the 2002 order from Ministry of Environment and Forest, we saw around 2003 and 2004 fish workers in Jambudvip losing their traditionally established access rights of merely drying their fish catch in Jambudvip Island within Sundarbans. So, what were those years like, 2002, 2004, 2006, and how did the Forest Rights Act, as we call it today, of 2006, gets legislated finally?
So I think in order to understand that, we need to look a bit further back, because the struggles for rights of forest dwellers or rights of ecosystem dependent people, including in wildlife sanctuaries, going back to the earlier discussion about this coexistence debate and conflict debate, was on from much earlier, right? From 60s, 70s, or of course even before that, even during colonial times, there have been struggles by forest dwellers to be able to claim their rights. So it's a much older thing, but what happened was that that 2002 order became a flashpoint, became a trigger for this kind of slowly emerging movement, patchy here and there kind of thing, to actually coalesce into a national movement. Because then we were talking about the possible eviction of a couple of million people, probably 1.5 to 2 million people. Huge, massive potential displacement. So that kind of coalesced in multiple different movements coming together on a national platform, with groups like Campaign for Survival and Dignity and others taking it up. Kalpvriksha was a small part of it. So CSD and others kind of taking it up in a very big way. The interesting part of that was that it became a coalition between these grassroots movements and Adivasi and other sorts of forest-dwelling communities, with legal groups, with human rights groups, with some conservation groups also, by the way, who recognize the importance of recognizing people's rights, coming together to then argue for a law which would overturn or turn back the Forest Act, the Indian Forest Act, and also to some extent the Wildlife Act. And that then became, because we also had, I guess, in the center, political dispensation that was somewhat open to these sorts of ideas and issues, and that then became a committee which then framed the law. But what was very interesting, two things. One is, from the conventional wildlife lobby, there was strong opposition, very strong opposition. They have absolutely no issue of rights. We had, like I was telling you earlier about the program we had on building bridges. So a number of the people who were involved with building bridges were kind of willing to come up to the point of saying no forcible eviction, but not recognizing rights. That step they were not willing to take, right? So there was lots of opposition. Subsequently, of course, once the Act came in, there were petitions filed in the Supreme Court, one of which, by the way, is, I think, coming up today or tomorrow or something like that, to the final judgment on whether eviction should happen or not to those whose rights are not recognized under the law. But anyway, so that culminated in the 2006 Act, when the committee that was framing the Act was going around asking for opinions and public hearings and all of that. There were lots of opposition from the wildlife groups. Interestingly, though, some of us were also raising this issue, saying absolutely the rights must be recognized, but there must also be safeguards for conservation. So in a way, we were kind of coming from another direction back into this, saying that there also has to be the responsibility of protecting all of that. And the first draft of the law actually had very strong duties for conservation, along with, of course, the strong rights. Subsequently, changes happened. But anyway, so I think there was enough of a coalition to make that act happen, right? And However, subsequently, the same government that brings it in, you can see the tokenism. They were willing to go to the point of bringing in the law. When it comes to implementation, virtually nothing, except where people's movements were still strong, and the occasional district collector was pro or whatever, where, like Gadchiroli and other parts of Maharashtra, etc. Otherwise, of the total amount of forest that should have been recognized under collective rights, for instance, probably less than 5% has actually been recognized. We're talking about 16 years later, or even 14 years later. But in any case, it was a very powerful movement that actually made that happen. And it was this combination of grassroots with urban groups, with lawyer groups, with etc., which made it happen.
So, one last question, and I'll come to Shrishti to talk about the rivers and the networks that she is developing. The National Biodiversity Study Action Plan. What reflection, what worked for communities, what didn't work, what are the lessons we learned as to having been able to put in so much energy and bringing in ecosystem people into the policy making framework and trying to give the nation state something. What are your experiences and what possible lessons can other groups draw from the experience?
So I think, just to give a quick history to those who don't know, late 1990s, after following up on the signing of the International Convention on Biological Diversity, India also was committed to producing a national biodiversity law, but also a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. For some reason, I think because of a couple of progressive officials in the Ministry of Environment, they actually opened it up as a bid for civil society to come and coordinate the process, which is very unusual, right? So Kalpvriksha was one of those groups that bid as in, put in a proposal saying we want to do it in a very participatory manner, have public consultations all over the country. And those officials liked that, so Kalpvriksha was chosen to coordinate that process. We also actually changed the entire budget, by the way, which the ministry and the UNDP, which was funding it, was open to, surprisingly. And the whole budget, which was so much of it was concentrated on picking 15 consultants to actually frame this whole thing, was distributed into 100 organizations all over the country, right? We would then get. Anyway, so we did a 4-year process. It was supposed to be 2 years, became 4 years, because we made sure every state was involved, local communities were involved, etc., and people across the entire spectrum. Government, even armed forces, local communities, lawyers, scientists, a whole bunch of them. More than 50,000 people were actually involved in the framing of the thing. And we made sure it was not just a national action plan, it was actually local, state, eco-regional, like for the whole Western Ghats, etc., and then of course national. So the ministry was actually extremely happy with the whole process. It was tom-tomming it as the world's most participatory exercise in biodiversity, which UNDP also accepted. But at the end, when we came up with our final reports, because we said that, look, if you really want to conserve biodiversity, you have to fundamentally change the economic patterns, fundamentally alter the political governance systems, including some issues we've been talking about, right, like eco-regional and local democracy and things like that. They got cold feet. The ministry there was also a change in guard, officials changed, the minister changed, etc. And at the last minute, after everything was done, final report submitted, they said, can't accept this. So that battle went for about 6 to 8 months. We kept trying to convince them. They kept saying no. We made some changes without compromising on fundamental. Some changes, like we said, no GM, no genetic modification, modified organisms. They said, we can't put this because X, Y, Z. So we said, okay, put all proposed GMOs through a rigorous procedure of impact assessment, essentially saying no, but in a different way. So those changes we made, but still they said no. So finally we released it as a people's action plan. And then bitter thing, they came up with this thing about Kalpvriksha has taken 4 crore rupees to make a completely flawed document, things like that, all that ugly stuff. So that's what we did. But so in a sense, we didn't manage to put it in as a national action plan. I still don't regret it though, because for us the process was as important as the final product. And if that process involved thousands of people, and it created a certain momentum on the ground for people to take action by themselves. For instance, the Dalit women farmers of Deccan Development Society, who were already doing some of this work, then carried on that action plan which they had produced into mobile biodiversity festivals and all kinds of other actions. Then they convinced their district collector to make Medak more into an organic district. So some such actions continued because the process involved these people. And so for me, I think the most important lesson for any further such exercises, make sure the process is as central as the product and make it as participatory and open as possible. The second lesson where I think we were weak, we didn't build enough political, as in party political momentum into this. So when it came to the final push, if we had had more of a party political kind of support, we could have probably used that to push the government, the Ministry of Environment into accepting this. So that's a weakness that we also realized. But otherwise it was an incredible process. I learned a lot.
I would recommend reading the People's Document as you publish it, because it gives us the feel of how consultative and how deeply energetic participative process it was to run that process through. And as you rightly pointed out, rather than the output, it's the process that has gone in truly participative, consultative fashion.
And it wasn't just, it was not just meetings and conferences and all, it was boat rallies, cycle rallies, public hearings, melas, festivals, all kinds of ways we tried to use to bring people into the thing and then use that, whatever outputs of that into the thing. So, I would love to do that process again. I don't think I have the energy. But, that's what we need to do for all such things.
Correct.
At whatever level.
Yeah. So, that brings me back to bringing some of my memories in and then having a conversation with Shrishti. When some of us, after our higher education, felt the calling for environment and went into the movement, the correspondences were like B2 writing to Meda to go to Northeast to fight against large dams, and saying these are not as large dams as Sadasur or Indira Sagar probably, but the biodiversity that is on the altar of development that we are going to lose forever is incredibly rich biodiversity. And from those early moments of Neeraj Wagolikar, our good friend from Kalpvriksha, Manju, and all trying to learn what was happening in Northeast, in Arunachal Pradesh, in Upper Assam, Subansiri Dam, for example, to now Shrishti leading the discourse around riverine rights and working with riparian communities. You get to travel a lot in the Vikalp Sangam process. How do you think the young student activists, communities, elderly people in the communities, women, are responding to this idea of giving, not giving, again see, these are the problems of the framework that has made your thinking pattern deeply flawed.
Recognize.
Holding conversations with natural elements and recognizing that they are as much living entities as we humans are, and they have given us much more than we can give back to the nature. How are communities, when you go to Ladakh, responding to discourses around nature's rights, rivers' rights?
Yeah, I think my own personal journey around this began very early on, which I never really realized until very recently, when I was trying to think about what disturbed me, why I got into environmental issues, and what was moving me when I was a child. And I think it was how I would see the river Ganga in my city in Kanpur, where I come from, which is the most polluted stretch of the river. And at that point also I would wonder, why would a river so revered, held as a goddess, is also polluted? And I held that question while I was also in the university, and in fact during one of the courses on ecological justice in India, that was my question of inquiry, that why do we pollute a river that is our goddess, that is our mother? So I think that question still pertains, and that is an existential question for a lot of communities and lot of us who are living along these ecosystems, of why they're unpolluted or why we bring so much destruction to them. And so while having a conversation with communities, it is also about that sometimes people are not the ones that are deciding this destruction, it is decided by outsiders. And so it is alive, it is being impacted, and so we were in Ladakh and we asked about why is climate change happening, and an elder in one of small remote village told us that it is because we have taken JCBs everywhere and it has disturbed the spirits of land and snow and water and whatnot. So it is a, though they recognize it alive and though they know that they have an agency and other such things, the control of being able to be part of the decision making of what happens to their territories is not with them. And so that's why it has become increasingly more important for us to find out what are these traditional systems that existed among communities, and that are still alive, to document those and find those interactions with the modern legal system, modern governance systems, to begin in very very small ways inserting these ideas that we have to look at governance not just from human perspective but also more than human perspective, and that in these times of climate change and ecological crisis this has become even more important. So if we keep ignoring this, the crisis is going to get bigger. If we don't bring in the perspectives of how peoples and communities see these ecosystems, we are going to be getting into a lot of major problems. So now our work is getting more into bridging those gaps, finding interactions, and trying to articulate these worldviews in a way that they can first find a platform to be articulated by people themselves and then integrating them in some ways in the formal systems till the time we have to work with them.
So, having led some of these brilliant environmental movements, from trying to build these dialogues around alternatives, what has been the journey like for you, Ashish and Shrishti? Tell us and our listeners a bit of how the idea of forming a coalition called Vikalp Sangam came in. There were coalitions like as you narrated during the conversation, Bharat Jan Andolan was there, Jan Sangharsh Yatra has come with the idea of Vikalp, or even the works of Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, Sangharsh or Nirman. From those early conceptualization, how Vikalp Sangam draws the energy, and when did the process start, how people responded to the process, what has been the journey like? Starting with you and then.
Okay. So I joined the process in late 2015, and so it has been 7 years, I think, of trying to understand what Vikalp Sangam process is. And it began in 2014 with the context of these large social movements talking about what is wrong with the current discourse, that we don't want this kind of development, we don't want this kind of economy, but not enough space to articulate what do we really want. And so peoples and communities coming together to share their experiences of creating on ground what they really want or what they are living. And so the idea and attempt of the Vikalp Sangam process is and has been that we create this platform for people's communities, NGOs, networks to come together to share their processes on ground of working towards alternatives, creating spaces of learning, exchanges, critical engagement, creating space of intersectionality and cross-sectorality, that people of different don't work in silos but rather how our different struggles inform each other's struggle, and how do we collectively reimagine our different societies, not just one kind of a society but multiple societies. So the journey of the Vikalp Sangam process, which is still on, has been to first facilitate these exchanges, document these really inspiring stories, because what we are bombarded with is all bad news, that things have gone wrong, things have gone bad. But there are these small, relatively small initiatives everywhere around us where people are attempting to change things. So why can't we talk about them? Why only about things that have gone wrong? So for me as a young person especially, that has been a very hopeful process to be part of, and I guess that's why I've sustained for these 6-7 years, because when I was in the university, I was reading so much about the critique of development and everything, and it made me very cynical. I used to think, okay, what will I do when I get out of the university? Where do I put my energies if everything has gone so horribly bad? But when I got engaged with the Vikalp Sangam process, it became another learning center and space for me, because people were doing enormous things. And when I got engaged with one specific community of Gond Adivasis in central India, where people are resisting against a mining project for 2 decades, yet they are celebrating life, yet they are fighting, yet they are struggling. So if they are not losing any sense of hope and still continuing, who am I to lose that? So I guess my whole sense of who I am also kind of changed with being engaged in the Vikalp Sangam process.
So I think, Shrishti is already given much of it, but the sense that we were getting better and better at resistance, not good enough, obviously, because of the forces that are up against us, but not really good at saying what we are for. Okay, no, but then yes to what. That sense was growing over the last few decades as we were involved in firefighting and more firefighting and kind of thing. But also because people were asking us this question. You're saying no to everything. What are you saying yes to? What's your solution? What's your answer? Now, not necessarily accepting that the answers always have to come from us. I mean, given that the state is actually the one that's creating the problem. But nevertheless, saying that we do have a certain vision or visions and responsibility to actually say, for us, if we're saying no to Sardar Sarovar project, which is supposed to give irrigation and power, here's the alternative for irrigation and power, or for more food production and energy, right? But beyond that, also the sort of more less tangible things like governance, like I was saying, who decides, what is democracy, or things like gender inequality, how does one deal with that kind of thing. So what we were also finding in our 40 years of experience was that people, like she said, was working in silos. So the agriculture folks, very strong organic farming movement, or say the strong feminist movement, or the strong movement for community health, were not working with each other so much. And that's what Vikalp Sangam is attempting to provide, that kind of a platform for talking to each other. We just had in early November, Worldviews Sangam, where people from about 10, 12 communities, indigenous Adivasi communities, pastoral communities, small farmer communities, have come together to talk to each other also, to learn from each other, people from Northeast, people from Kutch, people from Uttarakhand, to talk to each other to say, okay, how do we look at our respective worldviews as different but also common? What is common amongst us? What are the struggles that we're all struggling, and what are the answers that we're trying to give? That becomes hopefully eventually a much more powerful kind of thing, a critical mass of people who are questioning but also providing the answers. So that's the Vikalp Sangam sort of journey. But also from this we realize that we can't do this only in India, because now it's a global world, right? Globalized world. So we need also a global platform that can do this. So arising out of Vikalp Sangam and linking with other groups, we've started the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, similar platforms in different parts of the world coming together and doing very similar kind of sharing, collaborations, becoming more of a critical mass, raising issues at global levels also. So this local to global kind of a connect, local is also global in many ways, but sort of geographically, is also very, very important to sustain the solidarity networks also around the world. If any single, like Narmada or anything, any community here is threatened, there should be and needs to be a global response to that, saying we're looking at, we're keeping a watch on what's happening. So it's a combination of all of this that we're trying. Still early days. It's been 8 years, but it's still early days. We need much more.
So Ashish, we were discussing about the environmental movements and how, starting from the teenage young boy growing up in Delhi, responding to this changing environment around the reach, around the Arvalli forest, city losing the forest increasingly, and Delhi having that sort of history of being the capital throughout the Mughal era, and again, Mughal rulers were also benefactors. Certain city forests are Jahanpanah forest, for example. So, looking at the idea of forest as not just bewilderness, but forest that can be city forest like Delhi in 1970s, still with a lot of green places. And during Save the Ridge movement, you called Ridge the lungs of the capital city. From those days to now, in 2022, what has been the role of media? What has been the role of newspapers, both English language newspapers, magazines, the media, both print and electronic, responding to some of this environmental movement? I think I heard you saying the Gujarati regional language media, print media, in those days when the Sangharsh Yatra came up to Khairkua and was stopped by the police and the might of the state. Uh, what was the role of the media in presenting certain discourses, in presenting the environmental movements of India to the reading public? Uh, this is a long journey, 40 years you have seen. How has the role of media changed? And to Shrishti, the similar question, uh, what do you think is the role of social media in our times, shaping up some of this imagination, some of these ideas, and responding to the environmental movements?
So I think just to go back to the very first demonstration that we organized was against the hunting of endangered species like great Indian bustard and floricans by Saudi Arabian princes that the government of India had given permission to. And we held a small demonstration outside the Saudi Arabian embassy, about 12, 13 people with placards like eat custard, not bustard, etc. We actually just 13, 14 people got headline coverage the next day in the newspapers, right? I think that was an era in which maybe environment was seen as something new and I don't know, sensational or whatever it was, but there was an openness and I think also a sort of somewhat genuineness in the media to cover issues that were relevant or new issues that were becoming relevant. It was much easier also to get into the media then. We started writing in newspapers, op-ed pages, articles, etc. The television, of course, was not possible. So that's Doordarshan. So you could get occasionally something, if you did something on environmental education, not relatively non-controversial, that would come in, but not obviously a demonstration outside the Saudi Arabian embassy or against the Indraprasth power station or Narmada or whatever. But then comes the era of many newer, sort of more private channels coming in. Newspapers continued, more newspapers came in, more private channels came in. And still there was some amount of interest that was shown. There was a whole breed of journalists actually, a whole generation of journalists who kind of emerged also partly out of these movements, social movements, environmental movements, and joined the journalism and they were writing quite a lot in those days. Till we see, I would say, a big watershed would be the early 1990s onwards, when neoliberalism comes in, when sort of the new so-called new economic policies comes in, much more corporate control of the media comes in, apart from government remaining in control with whatever they have, but corporate control, much more money flowing into the media, 24/7 news channels, etc. I'm talking in pre-social media days, Shrishti will talk about that, but even then, you then begin to see that actually space for social, ecological sorts of issues begins to shrink. There's a significant amount of more coverage on politics, sports, fashion, basically, and business, of course, right? I think Sainath, the famous journalist, did this analysis where he showed that rural issues or agriculture issues were getting something like 2 to 4% coverage in the mainstream newspapers and channels. So, therefore, a lot of what we were saying or movements were doing actually begins to be sidelined by the mainstream media, which is where then the alternative media, which could be small NGO newsletters, during the Narmada movement, Abhiyan and many others there was some mainstream, but mostly it was like some of this alternative kind of stuff, NGO newsletters, etc., that were picking up a lot, which became the major channel for this kind of news to come in, and there was pretty good coverage. We could distribute to many parts of the country and many sections of population. But of course, there was no way we could compete with the main commercial media, and that's where I think much more marginalization has taken place since then. With social media, well, I can comment on that. Maybe I think Shrishti, you come in on that. But I would say that another issue that has been a weakness for us is that organizations like ours have not thought of dedicating enough time and resources to outreach, media outreach. communications, let's say. Even with Vikalp Sangam, after 6-7 years of doing Vikalp Sangam, we finally put in a full-time communications team, couple of people, a website and things like that, right? But we didn't, I think our mistake was we didn't think of communications as being a specialized role and media that could then reach out to much larger populations. We probably could have, should have done that much earlier. We were dependent too much on the external media rather than creating our own kind of media.
So I think one challenge has been of how do we communicate. I think it is also um, finding different ways of communicating with now changing population of how they receive information. I think it was a very different mode of receiving and absorbing information where people were okay to read long articles or long books, but I think for young people the attention span because of social media has reduced so much that their absorbing capacity of information is very different or it has changed. So also having different forms of communication, so through films, through graphic novels, through podcast and other such things, the communication of information is something that has to change. But also additionally that social media, as we have seen, has both positives and negatives. Positives in terms of like over the last 2 years when COVID was there and the government was using this time to push for more regressive laws and diluting the existing laws like environmental impact assessment. Young people use social media as a platform to mobilize and protest against it. And so it was a very powerful space for young people to express their dissent, and they used it quite powerfully. But it has another challenge as well, where in that doing kind of digital activism becomes the only form of activism. How do we ground that activism in actually going to the communities that are being impacted is an additional challenge that as young people who are using social media as a form of protest and as a form of sharing of knowledge also be cautious of that our activism only online is not enough, that it needs to be backed by our on ground activism. And so with and of course that most of social media is owned by the corporates. So how do we share the information, how do we use it for our own causes and for our own mobilizations and not get subsumed by the larger politics of the corporate control and information. It's a big challenge, the real challenge of how do we communicate on WhatsApp yet our information is ours. So those kinds of challenges are something that we have to mitigate in terms of sharing of information, but it also offers a huge potential as we have seen in terms of communicating some important things, creating certain online campaigns and activism. So yeah, I think it is a very dynamic space at the moment.
It's a quick addition. I think a crucial space here, which is beginning to be used much more, is community radio.
Yeah.
As a kind of an alternative to the mainstream media, and more than 150 community radio stations in India. Not all of them are running very well, but many of them are. And in that sense, I think for us to also be able to promote, encourage, and give relevant material to spaces like community radio or the mobile-based things like CG Net, Swara, and Chhattisgarh and others, that becomes a very crucial part of also these movements.
Correct. Correct. Also, what would you say, both Shrishti and Ashish, on the processes such as Rivers of Life? These efforts of trying to link school children, college going students, research students in universities with the ideas of celebrating nature and natural elements and its role within our framework of what we call quote unquote development, progress, democratic life, or community building. These efforts like Rivers of Life Festival or a similar effort on trying to bring the discussions around pastoral and nomadic communities. I believe even as we sit here in Rivers of Life in North in Shivnadar University, pastoral communities are gathering together and having conversations with students. They're under the process called Living Lightly. And why Living Lightly is because I believe during the during today's challenge of climate change ridden world, massive carbon emissions and all, it's these pastoral communities that are showing us that they have lived lightly on the earth. And if we need to keep our emissions in check, it's probably this very thrifty ecosystem people and communities that we can. So both the processes, in some ways, Rivers of Life Festival here, the earlier efforts of having Living Lightly exhibits and conversations around pastoralism, and the Vikalp Sangam dialogues that you people have done in different places around the country. What we can learn from processes and how we can reach large, and your response to the way Rivers of Life, your experience of what the festival was like.
So I feel that the major crisis that we are in is one big reason is about the kind of modern education we have today, where so much alienation happens from the rest of nature, which is where you're trained to become and do these kinds of things, of how, say for example, engineers are taught to see the rivers, and as in several schools there is no earth-centric curriculum. It is the curriculum which is based on training your mind to think in a certain way so that you can become a product of the modern dominant systems. So that this is where I wish I had a similar kind of opportunities to attend certain events like this, where you actually hear from people's communities, activists, people who are on the ground living these realities, responding to them, to truly know or at least begin to question what you know also from these people's perspectives, because our perspectives are so informed by what we see on television or what we hear in the news, which is already bought over. And now in this new information age where young people have so much information from mobile phones and other such spaces, social media, it is very difficult to figure out what is truth or reality. So these spaces at least bring in new perspectives, bring in new conversations. So this was the Rivers of Life exhibition was fantastically done in terms of bringing diverse views and peoples and ways of doing it differently, and reaching out to more and more students, because that's where I think the real change can happen, if we shift their way of thinking or at least open their way of different ways of thinking. If we can bring that at that young age, I think that would be tremendous.
Yeah, I think much appreciation for the Rivers of Life. I think it's a great concept and extremely well done. I'm very happy to also see a lot of school students here from government schools, private schools, etc. So I think that's really, I mean, obviously a lot of effort and thinking and conceptualization has gone into it. So fantastic there.
Thanks, Ashish Bhai and Shrishti, for speaking to us.